Hello and welcome to another edition of From the Vault. It's been a little bit since I've done one of these. Lots been going on in real life and here on the channel, but I wanted to go back in the time machine. And this episode holds a special significance. I'm going to show you something that is 35 years old. This is the cover of Dragon Magazine issue 80, and that's all it is. That's all that's left. Now, why did I save this cover? The reason is because this was the very first issue of Dragon Magazine that I ever got. This was my birthday present subscription. 1983, and this is the December 1983 issue. And my parents, for my birthday, got me a subscription to Dragon Magazine, and this was the first issue I got. So, many years went by, the actual magazine was lost. I'm not sure when or how. Maybe it was when I was away at college and my parents were cleaning stuff out. Many of you probably know how that feels to lose your precious game supplies to growing up. But I always kept this cover. I loved this cover. I loved this magazine. I loved this issue. This is what brought me into Dragon Magazine. But alas, all I had in my memories was this amazing cover. So before we delve into the magazine, I'm just going to say that I found it. I found Dragon Magazine issue 80 after years, and I'm talking years of searching, probably 20 years. Yes, since the 90s, I've been looking for this magazine. It was always on my nostalgia list of things that I needed to get back, and I finally found it. Here in the Chicago area, there is a old school classic comic shop called Gem Comics that carries just tons of back issues. And I was poring over their collection of magazines and I scored. I found it. So very excited to delve into this. Let's talk about that cover though. So this gorgeous cover was always something that was alluring to me. I found that there was a magic and a mystery in the covers to Dragon Magazine. And this one hooked me because it was my first, yes, but also because there was so much like arcane stuff happening. And I didn't really register why this hooked me so much, but it now that I think about it, it makes sense. It shows this sorceress. I'm assuming sorceress or wizard or what have you. And I guess in this edition of D&D, it would have been a wizard. So this wizard is gazing into this crystal ball, and there's a table with a skull and a candle on it, and two open books, and some kind of ancient dagger. But even like the frame for the crystal ball is like two little demons or devils like holding up this globe. And she has a pseudo-dragon over her shoulder, her familiar, and she's seated in this carved, ornate wooden throne. She's wearing this like tiara, this dragon tiara, and she's got all these adornments, and her eyes are full of like mystery as she gazes into this crystal ball. And just the whole scene in this cover art that was set just captivated me. It was literally like everything that I thought about with D&D. It just opens up. Just this image just opens up so many possibilities. You know, who is she? Is she some powerful NPC? Is she good, neutral, or evil? You know, we don't know. But she's definitely just surrounded by arcana of all sorts. And speaking of arcana, it's no coincidence that I'm also obsessed with the cover for the original Unearthed Arcana, which is a Jeff Easley artwork. This cover art for Dragon Magazine issue 80 was done by Clyde Caldwell. And again, it's something that, I mean, I've held on to just this one shred of what's left for, you know, almost 40 years or 35 years. And when I finally found the magazine, I was so excited because I knew that this was going to be a special episode of From the Vault. So the cover just by itself makes it worth it. But let's delve a little bit deeper. So I'm going to set aside my precious cover, and then I'm going to open up the actual magazine that we have here. So issue 80, my very first issue. You open up the front cover, and there's ads. There's a neat little ad here for ElfQuest figures from Ralpartha. And Ralpartha was one of the big companies for fantasy minis. Ralpartha, Grenadier, were some of the big companies. And ElfQuest at this time was like huge in the world of gaming. So these were cool little minis, and they show some examples, and they show you the different sets there. Then we have the table of contents. And, I'm not going to dwell too long on here, but this is Volume 8, Number 6, December 1983. So this was my 11th birthday, and my parents' gift to me was this subscription to Dragon Magazine. Which, back in 83, that was not necessarily cheap. That's, for a one-year subscription is $36. So that was, like, for me, that was a big deal. I came from a family of 7 kids, so we didn't always have money for big, fancy birthday stuff. So this was like a big deal for me. And this would have been, in the peak of my childhood phase of D&D and role-playing games. So little overview about what we have here. The psychology of the Doppelganger. That's going to be an interesting article. How many coins in a coffer? 5 keys to DMing success. Dungeon Master's familiar. Who lives in that castle? Treasures rare and wondrous. These guys really took their time. A set of rules for game reviews. And then some of the regular offerings are in there as well. The special for this issue is Barnacus, City in Peril. Intrigue for AD&D characters. So it was kind of a city setting adventure. So really cool. There are some notes in here from the author. And I'll just mention that the front cover is called Crystal Visions, and it's the latest in a long line of Clyde Caldwell creations to adorn the cover. Clyde, at this point, the author's note says, even though Clyde now works for TSR Incorporated and doesn't have a lot of time on his hands, he has promised to work on another cover piece real soon. So, it's hard when you don't, all you have is the author's mark or the artist's mark on the cover to figure out, who that was. So for many years, I had just this little symbol, and I didn't know, like, who did this awesome cover, So now that I know, it's fantastic because I can look up Clyde Caldwell's work, and maybe I'll buy some prints if they're available, or posters or whatever. So then there's, of course, some letters to the editor. I'm going to read a couple of these. And the reason why is because I think the letters to the editor reflect the mindset of gamers at the time and like kind of what they were thinking about. So here's the first one, discipline problem. Dear editor, I'd like to congratulate you on the whole issue of Dragon 78. The articles on psionics were well planned out and well written. They cleared up many problems and misunderstandings, and the new class and its psionic powers make a new and different type of character, not a subclass. The only question I have is this: can a psionic person, not of the psionicist class, use the major and minor disciplines under Table 3, or are those limited to that class only? Chris Beck, Tucson, Arizona. And then they respond. It's not really the answer that I'm interested in, it's more the question. So this is a reflection of the fact that, at the time, like TSR had just released all this stuff about psionics. And if you played D&D in the old days, you were kind of in one of two camps. Either you liked psionics and you thought they were a really cool innovation to the game, or you thought that psionics broke the game and you just refused to use them. Me and my group were kind of part of the latter camp. We tried it. We tried integrating psionics into the game, and it just felt like any psionicist was just crazy way more powerful than the rest of the group. It just wasn't balanced, in my opinion. It didn't allow for an even game. The second letter to the editor is also about psionics. Psionic repairs. Dear editor, a short note to pass on to you 2 corrections that need to be made to my psionicist article in number 78. And that's basically from the author, Arthur Collins, who wrote that. Okay, so that's just a little reflection of like what was going on in 1983. A lot of talk about psionics. There's a question about gold, and that was another thing. Like, economy hadn't really been figured out. There was a lot of adventurers walking around with hundreds of thousands of gold pieces, which, of course, now we look back on that and that's ridiculous. But the economy hadn't quite been figured out. Here's a little full-page ad for James Bond 007, a role-playing in Her Majesty's Secret Service. So this was put out by Victory Games. I don't really remember that game company, so they might have been a smaller game company, but somehow they got the rights to produce 007 content, and they have a whole bunch of adventure modules and gaming sets. So the basic set, Goldfinger, Octopussy, Q, Game Master's Pack, basic game. So looks pretty cool. All right, now we get to our first article. And this article I actually remember from 35 years ago. It's called The Psychology of the Doppelganger. And there was a whole series of these things where Dragon Magazine in issues would put out kind of the psychology of, and then you insert a monster from the Monster Manual or one of the other books. This one was awesome, though, because doppelgangers are incredibly interesting for DMs to employ in a game. Just the idea that you could have someone who isn't particularly strong or vicious or nasty from a combat perspective, but who could totally engage with the players and with other NPCs in the gaming world and create intrigue and mystery, was really kind of a breakthrough, because for a lot of people for a long time, D&D was hack and slash. It was you go on an adventure, you kill the monsters, you get the treasure, rinse and repeat. But a doppelganger, if used right, could really create an ongoing storyline. So this issue is a gem just for this article, but so much more. So there's a cover picture here where it shows on the left panel, almost like a comic book, you have the doppelganger kind of waiting here, and he's looking around the corner at this nobleman who's walking down the way. And then in the next frame, the doppelganger has become the nobleman. So I think of the doppelganger, because of this article, as like the ultimate spy or infiltrator, but there's so much potential with doppelgangers. So the article is by Fraser Sherman. I'm going to read a couple of the paragraphs, because this is kind of the narrative intro into this. And actually, it's a gem. There were no guards at the door, which was as he wished it. No one must know that the captive had not been slain with its partner. Looking unusually nervous, Nissen, Baron of Kerr, swung open the door and stepped into the room, closing the door tightly behind him. The chamber, a hastily cleared storeroom, held two figures besides the Baron. Alam Arija, wizard, alchemist, and scholar, bowed low at the entrance of his master. Beside him, bound to its chair by a net of interwoven crimson threads, was a grotesque parody of a human figure. Gray and pulpy, its bloody red eyes stared at Nissen with open malice from out of its warty face. And then, almost in an instant, it changed. "Good greeting, my lord." Nissen froze in mid-stride, stunned to see his own image staring mockingly up at him. "Alam, would you release me? I'd like to meet this man who resembles me so much." "Silence!" Anger replaced shock as Nissen's gauntlet smashed across the creature's face, up to the throat. Twin to his own, he thrust a dagger. "Resume your own form, doppelganger, immediately." "As you will." The doppelganger's voice became more sibilant, less human, as it changed back. Nissen sheathed the dagger, studying the creature grimly. He and Alam had found it with its companion as one of them prepared to replace the castle chaplain, and after a bitter struggle, the Baron overcame them. Their soft-looking bodies were surprisingly tough, and in battle they seemed able to anticipate his every move, dodging his attacks easily, then striking through his defenses with unbelievably punishing blows. And Nissen's determination to take one of them alive hadn't made that fight any easier. "Can it break free, Alam?" "Not from the blood-red chain, even if it duplicated my form. The chain would spoil any spells it might draw from my mind." The wizard looked down at the prisoner in fascination. If I could only duplicate its ESP powers, they're far beyond anything magical or mental that humans possess, operating almost constantly without conscious effort. But then their brains are structured quite differently from ours. They can't be charmed at all, you know. Yes, I know. Alam had explained their powers before, as the Baron now recalled, how a doppelganger could not only probe surface thoughts and knowledge, but also tap things lying just below the surface, like knowledge of your own identity, and use what it learned and its polymorphing power to replace the victim. After all, it would draw constantly on the minds of its victims' friends, learning what they expected of its new form and changing its behavior accordingly. Some said that even made them more believable than the originals. Then Nyssen broke off his reflections as he realized his wizard was saying something more. I'm going to stop there, but the whole page here goes on with this narrative, which is really kind of cool because it almost takes an encyclopedic entry about a doppelganger and turns it into a story, a narrative. And that gives DMs ideas for how they could use doppelgangers in their games, in their campaigns. And I mean, boy, when I read this, even as an 11-year-old kid, my mind was spinning with ideas. I just couldn't stop thinking about how to use this kind of stuff. And I tied it into actual history. I thought about like in the history of England, or the history of France or Germany, when there would be, attempts at coups with different monarchs and stuff. And I thought, wow, if you combined that with a fantasy setting like D&D and you included doppelgangers in that mix, how much more complex would that be? How much more fun would it be for the party to try to figure out who the real person is versus who is the doppelganger? So just so many ideas come from that. I'm going to touch on the appendix here. Because the whole article is just kind of this narrative thing. But in the appendix here at the end of this article, it says, since the doppelganger's armor class and attack damage are partially derived from its ESP abilities, it will suffer against an ESP-proof opponent, such as a monk or a character with the psionic discipline of Mind Bar. Against such foes, its armor class will equal leather armor, AC 8, and it will do only 1 to 6 points of damage per attack. Then I'm going to skip down another paragraph to the less crunchy stuff that I also found more interesting. Doppelgangers have never been known to sleep. They appear biologically incapable of it, though in their altered forms they will, of course, pretend to be asleep when such action is appropriate, and or when it will prevent them from being discovered for what they are. Though doppelgangers can form their bodies into the appearance of clothing, equipment, weapons, they generally avoid doing this because of the obvious problems they would have if asked to drop something they appeared to be holding or wearing. Often, they simply borrow materials from the body of whomever they are imitating and wear or carry those. Though listed as being neutral in alignment, doppelgangers might be more correctly viewed as neutral evil, or at least neutral with evil tendencies. They show little respect or concern for humanity and allied races, except when doing so benefits them. They are not prone to go out of their way to promote wickedness, however, and can act in a helpful manner, again, when it suits them. So I think doppelgangers overall are incredible. And I think at the same time, though, that there's something that you have to use sparingly. You can't have like every plot or intrigue that you have going on in your campaign involving some doppelganger, because at a certain point, your players are going to figure out that like every suspicious person is a doppelganger, or it'll just turn them into really paranoid people who think that every suspicious person is a doppelganger. But I think when well used, it could just be such a cool thing. And the fact that this article from 1983 was recognizing the doppelganger as something worth exploring for DMs and sharing this kind of narrative to reveal a little bit more about the depth of a doppelganger was really valuable for a kid or for any adult, really. So, all right, moving on to the next article. How many coins in a coffer? Don't forget, all that treasure takes up space, by David F. Godwin. The values and weights of the various coins in the AD&D game system are reasonably well defined. A coin of any type weighs approximately a tenth of a pound, or 1.6 ounces. But many DMs are continually faced with the problem of the volume of large number of coins. How many coins will fit into a coffer, a chest? If a room is filled with copper pieces to an average depth of 1 foot, how many copper pieces are there in a 20 by 20 foot room? How big is a gold ingot weighing or worth 200 gold pieces? In the official modules, ingots crop up all the time. Finally, the ultimate question: how many coins can you cram into a portable hole? To solve these problems, we need to know the size of the coins. Nothing is said about the actual size in the AD&D rulebooks, although the player's handbook says all coins are relatively the same size and weight. It's a fine point, but does relatively mean same size and weight, equal with respect to one another, or approximately equal? Having all coins of the same size and weight is very convenient, even necessary for game purposes, but it is fundamentally an absurd idea. Platinum weighs almost 2.5 times as much as copper, so how can coins of equal size weigh the same? And if they weigh the same, how can they be the same size? I'm going to stop right there. This is an article that's really interesting from a crunchy, old school kind of way. So there are some of us in the gaming community who love to really think super realistically, who love to crunch the numbers, who love to do the math. And this, after all, we're calculating volume, is going to end up being an article about math. And there's already a lot of number crunching going on and logistics. Part of me loves that stuff. There's a nerdy part of me that just loves all that stuff. And there is a part of me that when I'm running games, not just D&D, but any games, I like it to be realistic. I don't like when players can just carry some absurd amount of crap around with them because it's not realistic. But I think now, 35 years later, I think there are relatively easy ways, without going deep into the number crunching, of figuring out what a reasonable amount of coins or anything really is for a player character to carry. So it's an interesting article. If you happen to go and find this back issue and you wanted to read it yourself, cool. And they come up with some interesting solutions. So they come up with, one possible halfway realistic solution is to say that all coins weigh 1/10 of a pound each and have a diameter of about 1.5 inches, that of a silver dollar coin, but that the thickness varies according to the relative weight of the metal used. That's a really easy solution, right? So a platinum piece that's the size of a silver dollar coin would be thicker because it weighs more. Copper would be thinner. Easy solution, boom, wash your hands, done. But that's not all, because they talk about the problems with having different thicknesses. So it's a pretty deep analysis that goes on for 3 pages. And towards the end of the article, which I'm just going to skip to, we now have the following data for a standard typical coin regardless of metallic composition in the AD&D game. Weight is 1.6 ounces, diameter is 1.5 inches, thickness is 2.54 millimeters, volume is 2.9 cc's, and specific gravity is 15.66. I told you there would be math because nerds love math. Especially nerds in 1983 playing AD&D. That's the entirety of this article. They literally calculated gravity. When they said that they were going to figure out the volume, they said they're meaning they're going to figure out the volume. And I'm sure at the time there was just hordes of nerds who were like, "Ha, this is superb," or hordes of nerds who would then write letters to the editor and somehow complain about some calculation being incorrect. Anyway, I'm skipping it because I never cared that much. I always kind of went more with a let's go with common sense. Your character can't carry 50,000 gold coins. Let's make it reasonable. So right underneath that is a ad for Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan miniatures, made by FASA Corporation, which was based in Chicago. Those of you who don't know, FASA was the corporation who also came up with games like Shadowrun. So it looks like they had a little dip into producing minis or selling them for Star Trek. Oh my God, it goes on and on. I thought the article was over, but it's not. I'm sorry. So it's not 3 pages, it's 5 pages with ads for nerds. And then at the very end, there's a table for platinum, gold, silver, copper, universal, and dollar, with specific gravity, the weight, the volume of the coin, and the thickness. So in case you just needed to know all those things, nerds, there you go. All right, here's a perhaps more productive article. This starts on page 14, and it's called 5 Keys to DMing Success. Make it easy on yourself and fun for your players by Mike Beeman. So I'll talk about the keys first. So first is continuity. The second is character. The third is competence. Looks like Mike's going with a C theme. Yep. The fourth is creativity. And the fifth is cooperation. So let's recap. Dungeon mastering, if you're good, is not a hobby. It's a career. Wow. That is a great first 2 sentences, because I feel like that's something that really relates right now. There's a lot of talk on the internet about dungeon mastering and paid dungeon mastering, or at least, dungeon mastering for some compensation. Some people have really strong feelings against that. Some people say it's totally okay because the dungeon master is putting in so much time to create, rich, vibrant worlds and NPCs and storylines and plots and hooks and all that stuff. So here back in 1983, Mike Beeman is asserting that dungeon mastering is a career. The creation and execution of a campaign that will completely engross players and keep them happy and eager to play more is a task on par with finding the Holy Grail. It's too much work. Besides, it's not exceedingly profitable. So what can we do about it? Quit our jobs, leave school, and make the players support us? Unfortunately, no. Well, there are some people that are doing that nowadays, thanks to the internet. There are people who are YouTube content creators who focus on gaming, who have literally big enough following and supports and patrons to be able to quit their day job and do this full time. So interesting to reflect on that. Back to Mike's article. What we do find is a way to skimp on the labor without cutting down the excitement and suspense we work so hard to build up. Every good campaign has 5 basic elements: continuity, character, competence, creativity, and cooperation. If you're able to maintain all 5 in your campaign, then you're way ahead of most of us, and you're probably spending a lot of time dungeoneering or wishing you were. There are shortcuts to achieving all 5 of the basic campaign elements that take some of the wear and tear off your overworked gray matter. They are necessarily of a general nature. Specific suggestions are obviously impossible, but astute application of these principles can save loads of time and lots of browbeating. So this was an article that I remember reading, but at the age of 11, I had not become like the full-time dungeon master. I did DM quite a few games at that age, but we would rotate. So me and my friends would rotate DMing. And also, we had older siblings who would DM for us. So I'll probably admit that at the age of 11, I did not soak up all the wisdom that comes from this article, but it is full of hella good information, and it makes sense. So I'm going to try to summarize this. We'll talk about the first point, continuity. So continuity in a campaign is a very complex thing. It is in a campaign which makes it more than just a series of dungeons, and that which ties all of the dungeons together into a cohesive whole. Many DMs have trouble with continuity. It requires more than a little preparation, often mundane, that is not directly linked to adventuring. A campaign consists of much more than a group of bloodthirsty adventurers going out and killing things, stealing their money and magic, then dropping by their local village only to be off again in a few days. He basically just summarized the phenomenon that we would later understand to be murder hobos. But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but continuity is something that really evolved over time in gaming, because the early days of gaming were just serial adventures, really, and very few DMs put time into ongoing narratives. And that is something that now I think we can teach newer gamers, that, you want to have it be like an ongoing narrative. You don't want it to just be one book and then another book. You want it to be an ongoing series of stories, and that's what makes a whole series really enriching. Even if characters die off, there's still like you're building a history now with NPCs and a history with adventures, and that's what can make a campaign world so rich. So I think he hits the nail on the head with the continuity thing, and it's great advice. Moving on to character. So everybody has to be somebody. Good players will usually freely develop and faithfully play a character's personality in a role-playing game, complete with idiotic idiosyncrasies and inexplicable personal preferences. Even so, a good DM will give every character a focal point for his life, or something that will make him feel important or special. There are several ways of doing this, but in whichever method you choose, be extremely careful not to force the player into anything. That's a hugely valuable point, because really, when you think about it, it's kind of, there's a couple different DMing styles or game mastering styles. A lot of times the game master drives this entire story, and the players have to just go through the steps. And as a player, I hate that. And as a GM, I hate it. And that's basically what he's describing is, you want to give the players little hooks that make them feel like they're included in the narrative. And you want to give them freedom to make choices, whether it's good choices or stupid mistakes. But you don't want to force them down specific paths, because then it almost becomes like a choose your own adventure, very like rote, kind of boring, like A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D. So he makes that point about how you hook players and get their characters involved in the game, but don't force feed them their own storyline. Let them make these choices. Skipping ahead to the third point he's making is about competence. If you feel inclined to dungeon master, there are only two things you really need to be a pretty good one, aside from an active imagination. The first, of infinite import, is a working knowledge of the rules. You don't have to be a textpert capable of rattling off the stats of every single monster. Just know enough so that you know what you're doing. The second requirement of a competent DM is a sense of the dramatic. A dungeon master has to know, often instinctively, how to build suspense and climax for maximum effect. He has to lend variety and substance to as many as 100 NPCs, perhaps more, in every session. A DM is basically a playwright for characters in need of a play. That's a great way to put it. And there's a lot of truth in what he's saying here, and that's hearkening back to first edition AD&D. So when I think about it now with other games, that's totally spot on. And it's advice that I tell people all the time. If you're new to the game, you should know the rules, the basics of the rules. But if you don't know for sure, just kind of get a consensus at the table, make it up as you go along, and you'll figure it out later. When I was a little kid, we didn't know all the rules. I built my vocabulary and my literacy by reading a lot of those books, but I didn't know all the rules, and neither did my friends. So sometimes we'd be playing a game, something would happen, and we'd make a judgment call, and we'd just go with the flow. Oftentimes, it didn't go that way. We'd make a judgment call, and then we'd end up arguing back and forth, and poring over books, and rules lawyering. Some of my friends were specifically known for arguing about every single rule if they didn't like how we adjudicated that rule. So bottom line is, though, after years of playing games, 40 years of playing role-playing games, I can tell you that, as a rule of thumb, like, if you can find the rule quickly, cool. If not, just move along. It's about the narrative. Venturing is having fun, and it's about the narrative. Yeah, Mike makes a good point here. You have to know enough to run the game, and that expert sense about the rules will come along as you play more. The next point is about creativity. Creativity is the cornerstone of AD&D gaming, and I would argue any role-playing games. If a campaign is to survive, it can't be a repetitive series of hack and slash forays into the underworld. Well said. Now again, I'm going to admit that when I was 11 years old, I probably didn't catch the depth of all of these tips, but now that I'm 45, I can absolutely look at all of this wisdom and recognize it for what it is. And basically what Mike's talking about here is that you need to have a diversity of adventures and challenges and stories and plot hooks. And a lot of people feel overwhelmed. A lot of DMs and even a lot of players who start off in role-playing games shut themselves down because they're like, well, I'm not a creative person. But the reality is that creativity is just like a muscle. The more you use it, the better you become with creativity. So, don't worry about having to come up with adventures and NPCs and storylines and plot hooks from nothing, because you don't have to. You can cheat, you can steal from reality. Look to history, look to culture, look to the mythology of other cultures. There are stories everywhere around us. All you have to do is kind of find something that sounds interesting and borrow it and adapt it for your own game. I mean, literally, pick a country anywhere in the world, look at their history, and you'll find characters, you'll find plots, you'll find mysteries, you'll find intrigue, and you'll find treasures and rumors. There's so much that's all already told, so many stories that are already told. And if you can't find that from history, find it from literature, find it from books, from movies, from TV shows. But the idea is that creativity is important, and you want to provide adventures for your players, no matter what game you're playing, that are stimulating. And you can't get stimulation if you just do the same adventure over and over and over again with a different skin. So you got to challenge your players with different things. And one of the things I'll tell to newbie DMs is, don't think of challenge as just monsters. It's not all about combat. A lot of times challenge can just be getting the party to work together to do a single task. One of the most fun adventures that I ever had as a kid, and this is like probably 6th grade, was me and a couple of my friends were having a sleepover, and my friend's older brother decided to DM a game for us, and we literally had to transport like a wagon full of goods from one village to another. That was it. We didn't fight a single monster. And the biggest challenge was that a huge oak tree had fallen in the road after a rain. We couldn't take the wagon around because it'd get stuck in the mud, so we had to figure out how to move the giant oak tree. And we didn't have axes or saws. And basically, like, we had to figure out leverage, how to move, how to roll this tree using leverage. So, like, there was no combat at all, and it was one of the most fun adventures that we had, trying all these dumb different ways to move this tree out of the way so we could take a cart from one village to the other. And that's not super creative, but it was engaging because it was a non-combat challenge. So he makes a great point with the creativity thing here. He references a couple, ways for DMs to get ideas. And I'm going to read this paragraph here because it echoes exactly what I just said. So, how can you make it easier to be creative? That's simple. Plagiarize. Plagiarism is perhaps the dungeon master's most valuable tool next to his own imagination. I do not mean you should take your favorite fantasy book and convert it into a dungeon, which is very easy and appallingly common. All that will result in is a lifeless rerun or an unmitigated disaster. Players never do what you expect them to do, and if you try to force them into a plot of your own devising, they'll do everything they can to make life for you unlivable. They won't do it on purpose, of course, but they'll manage. When you feel the need to plagiarize, only glean a few of the best ideas from the book or movie and work them into an original or modified setting or plot. This is called creative plagiarism. Your job is to set up a general setting and plot, not dictate all the action. A series of campaign adventures can be a plagiarist's paradise. One I know of took its basic plot and setting from Stephen Donaldson's first Covenant series, with a few items from the movie The Vikings and Roger Zelazny's Dilvish the Damned to confuse things. Players love romping in places and with people they've read about, but you have to maintain enough mystery and suspense to keep them guessing about what is going to happen next. Even though several players in the above campaign were familiar with the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, they never found an easy solution to their problems. Keeping the challenge alive is the key to good plagiarism. Your own original creation will often be your best, and you should never be content to let others do most of the work. Keep the juices flowing, but when you do run into dry spells, don't worry about tapping another's imagination. Great tip. So again, this is a 35-year-old article, but it still speaks to so much wisdom and advice for DMs today. The last point is cooperation. I'm going to read this one, the first couple paragraphs, because I think the way he phrases this is really crucial, and it addresses a lot of, frankly, problems that gaming groups have to this day, no matter what game they're playing. And that is the kind of whole sense of, how do you cooperate together. Role-playing games are a cooperative storytelling experience, okay? So let me read this, this bit from Mike, and this is the last of his 5 tips. This is it, folks, the ultimate work saver. Share the chores with somebody else. You can't do it all alone, believe me. If your players call every day to ask, can we play today? And if you have as much trouble saying no as I do, then you'll soon be DMing completely off the top of your head, trying to referee half-formed adventures and eventually spoiling the hard-won continuity of your campaign. Sharing the work will take a lot of pressure off you, both as creator and administrator. It'll give you a chance to play, and you do need to play to evolve properly as a DM. When one of 2 or more participants serves as dungeon master for a certain session, it'll give the others a little time to relax and prepare what comes next. I mentioned earlier in this video that in my group as kids, when I got this magazine, that I wasn't always the DM. And it's because we all wanted to play the game. At that age, nobody wanted a DM because we were kids and we all wanted to play the game instead. So we took turns, like kind of begrudgingly. It wasn't until a couple years later that I actually liked DMing more than playing. So, but at the age of 10, 11, during this era, everybody wanted to play their characters. And now I look back on it, and especially in reflection of what this article is saying, and it was really important that we shared that workload. And here's why. Not only did it allow us each to have a chance to play the game so that we all felt like we were getting an equal turn to play our characters and level up, but at that age we were kind of competitive, and we were a group of boys, so everybody was like competing to who would have the best character, whose character would live the longest, that kind of stuff. So rotating who DM'd was important at that time. We also rotated, and now as I look back on it, we learned from each other. Maybe not consciously. I don't know if while my friend Justin was DMing, I was actually consciously thinking about like his style and what I liked about his style and what I didn't like, or if he was evaluating me in the same way, or if when our friend Steve was running the game, we were evaluating, how he ran the game. So, but we definitely learned from each other. There were things that I took from my friends' DMing styles that I started to incorporate into my own, and that's natural, it's organic, right? It's like with any activity, any sport, like you learn from the people who are on your team. You learn with them. So there's another reason why rotating DMing was important. The other thing is we didn't just rotate DMing for Dungeons & Dragons. We rotated games. So sometimes we'd play D&D campaigns, and then we'd get a little like weary of that, and then somebody would run a Gamma World campaign or a Top Secret campaign or any of the other TSR games that were around at that time that we played. So sometimes just getting out of the genre or game and playing something different was good for the creative juices, and it was good to rotate so that you could give other people a chance to run a game. So that article was huge. And even, like I said, even if when I was 11 I didn't absorb all the wisdom from it, I remember these tips being important, and I kind of remember trying to integrate some of these things. All right, next article. Told you this magazine was going to be deep. Dungeon Master's Familiar, a program for computer-conducted combat by John Warren. Okay, so for those of you who are young, in 1983, computers were very basic. And by basic, I mean literally the programming language that most of us learned in school was BASIC. So this was an era where programming and doing math through programs was kind of fun. And this was a foray into helping DMs streamline things. So instead of having to have 3 or 4 books open and a DM screen with charts, you might use your computer using Microsoft Basic to... I have to laugh because I'm looking at this. I'm just going to read this to you. This is like a time capsule. This program was written to run on a Radio Shack TRS-80, but it can be used easily in any computer that uses a variation of Microsoft Basic. So TSR-80s were like the go-to computer when I was a kid. TRS-80 was also referred to as Trash 80. They were just big, clunky, green screen monitor computers. But people used them, and they started nerding out writing programs. So here, literally typed up, is how to create some helpful dice rolling things. So there was literally, here's all the code in BASIC. I mean, if I wanted to go type this up, I'm sure I could figure out a way with some emulator to make it work now. But I haven't typed up code in probably 30 years. But just looking at the code, it looks like you basically have the ability to roll dice, to do a combat sequence, to display a character, to write a character file, to load a character file, or to end the program. So basically there's a table of contents that would then run these different subroutines that were built into the program. So this is not really useful now per se, unless you just had nostalgia and you wanted to write a program in BASIC. But it just shows you, like, this is a reflection of the time. Like, this is when role-playing games and other things in our world in 1983, like computer programming, was becoming a thing. And I mean, I remember it. Like in 83, I would have been 11. So I think I would have been in like 5th grade. And this was like, you know, that was when we were learning about computer programming. And I remember our elementary school had like, you know, 6 machines. And then the middle school had like a whole lab, and it was amazing. And you could write like computer programs. And I remember learning about like if-then statements where, you know, you could basically make a choose your own adventure, D&D style, like text adventure. And you could choose, like, you know, do you do this? And if you do, then it goes to this page. And if you don't, then it goes to that page. And it was fun. Like, it was stimulating. But just an interesting little kind of flashback thing where, you know, Dragon Magazine and the gaming industry was recognizing that a lot of the nerds who played role-playing games also happened to really be into computers. And so they offered this, which I think was smart, you know. And right below it, we have Map Master. It's a game aid. So it's a computer program that helps you map out things, made by Judge Software. It was only $35. So that was yet another example of integrating, you know, computer stuff with gaming back in the early days. Oh, I'm sorry, look, let's cut back to this. 1, 2, how many pages of code, you ask? 3, 4, good Lord. Okay, then it ends. So 4 pages of code, wow. All right, here we are. Next article. Who Lives in That Castle? Building it's one thing, but running it is another, by Catherine Kerr. What is a castle? So she goes into this. Now, in other episodes of From the Vault, I think you might remember some articles by Catherine Kerr. And her articles tend to be really detailed and draw a lot from history. So I'm not, there's no way I could read through this all without this episode of From the Vault being like 7 hours long. But it's really cool, and this is exactly the kind of detailed article that drew into historical insight and made a lot of references to how things were done. And in this case, she's using a lot of references with like medieval Europe. But the amount of detail and the historical accuracy just appealed to me at that age especially, but still does. And it's kind of like looking at how things in reality work, but not in the mathematical way that earlier article with currency and the like how much gold could fit into a coffer kind of thing, but more like about the really like who lives in a castle, you know? So it's not just a king and like a servant. It goes into great detail about the employees of that, the serfs, different kinds of castles, the noble inhabitants and the retainers and the officials. And it goes on for 4 pages. So a lot of really cool stuff there, some interesting kind of historical illustrations. Here's a quote: "Any good-sized castle shelters a surprisingly large number of servants." And that's, you know, yet another example of that kind of tying in the historical element. So, oh, did I say 4 pages? I meant 6. Who pays for all this? So she talks about whether bushels or of wheat or silver coins, disposable wealth has to come from somewhere. And the somewhere of the manorial economy is the labor of the tenant peasants, or serfs, as they are commonly known. So really cool way to go into the history of castles. And then at the end of this article, I'm sorry, not the end, 3/4 of the way through, she talks about the player character's castle. So now that the GM understands the requirements of a working castle, he is in a better position to supervise any players who wish to have their characters build strongholds, a process far more complex than the modern procedure of buying a piece of real estate and hiring a contractor. So people, remember, this article and Dragon Magazine as a resource was out long before game companies were publishing whole source books about castle building. Like that would be years later. So these articles were gold for DMs and for players and for groups because there really wasn't official published material on how to do this. And oftentimes it would just be a short blurb in like the DM's guide. So these expansions on those thoughts of how to do it were really valuable. She goes on to talk more in detail here too about the castle in the campaign and kind of, how to integrate it into a campaign. And then she says a note on further reading. So she references a couple inspiration pieces. And it's a great article. Here on that same end page, we see an advertisement for Suspense in the 1920s, Call of Cthulhu. And that is approved by Arkham House, published by Chaosium. So that was an awesome game back in the day. Okay, so we're getting about halfway through. I'm going to summarize these. We're going to have to move fast. Treasures Rare and Wondrous by Ed Greenwood. So Ed Greenwood is one of the great old masters, and it looks like here he put together a interesting little list of treasure. And again, when you're talking about resources, this kind of stuff in issues of Dragon Magazine was gold. It was like getting extra content from your DM's guide that wasn't published with the hardcovers. So here's just a random, percentile dice roll with little explanations of crap that could be found. Some of it's valuable, some of it's just mundane. But, it's funny because there's a list like this of trinkets now in the 5th edition Player's Handbook. I could take this, even though it's 35 years old, and I could use this in my next campaign just to add a little flavor. If I rolled a 30, I'd get a medallion, electrum, inlaid with copper, in design of a phoenix rising from flames, spherical 4-inch diameter. There you go. Crescent moon belt buckle. So yeah, it goes on for pages because it's a percentile. So there are 100 listings of things that you could find randomly. Okay, then so we're only on page 35, and here we are with Barnacus, City in Peril, an AD&D adventure for 4 to 8 characters, levels 1 through 5. This was first place for the Module Design Contest, category A8, designed by Francois Nantal. I'm going to guess that Francois was French or maybe Quebecois. So this is, it provides a little background. It has notes for the DM. It has tables for encounters. And then it explains encounter situations for the tables. Table 1, Table 2. It goes into the situation of what's going on in the city, rumors that are in Barnacus. Then it describes specific organizations like the Snake Pit. The Snake Pit is a spy organization composed of 18 members, all under the command of Cleckless Rokoba, ruler of the Wizards Guild. Then it talks about the city itself, gateways, inns, the castle, the night house, the army barracks. There's just a whole bunch of descriptions of the space and a map, because what adventure module would be complete without a map? Now, this once again is a great example of the kind of resources that you would get with your subscription to Dragon Magazine. And remember, people, this was my first magazine. So, I mean, my mind was just, I was blown away by how much cool stuff was in this magazine, and I couldn't wait every month for the next installment. But here's a whole adventure module. And if you think about it, buying a module back in the day would have cost probably double the price of the cover price for this magazine. So I was getting all these cool articles and a free module. You couldn't beat it. Great map. And sometimes with modules, you wouldn't even run the whole thing. We'd just pick out things we liked about the module and almost use it like a source book and then, tweak it for our own needs. But here's a great map. I could use this map in this city and, cheat it to any setting and use it even now, 35 years later. There's little sub-maps down here, the abandoned house, passages through the catacombs. I mean, this is a really complete thing. chambers in the catacombs. Really, really cool. While we're looking, here's a Grenadier Models ad, full-page ad for their minis. There's a dragon there and a bunch of fantasy lords. Okay, so that was the end of the module, Barnacus. Awesome stuff. Then we have a recurring bit in the magazine by Leonard Lakofka, Lehman's Tiny Hut. This is new charts using the 5% principle by Gygax and Lakofka. So the following material is not official, but is provided for your study and comment. Gary Gygax has said that an expanded combat results table is certainly desirable, so perhaps that part of the following information will eventually be made part of the official rules. So they're basically restructuring the combat charts for first edition. So they have a whole list, an attack matrix for all character classes and monsters, broken up into the classes, monsters, and then the opponent's AC. And they basically restructure the math. I'm not going to dwell on this, but it's, I think, very indicative of the fact that, you know, the Dragon magazine was kind of building this background canon, almost like the modern Unearthed Arcana does now online. They were kind of putting out these updates on a regular basis. Here's another full-page article right here, Imperium Challenge. So here's another computer-moderated game, okay? So again, just integrating gaming with nerds and computers was a natural thing. Like this was happening back in '83. Here's StarQuest. Yeah, so more of that. All right, more tables there. Yep, good. More tables, crunchy, first edition nerddom. These guys really took their time. There's an article about some people playing a game. I'm going to skip that. Here's more ads. Okay, Fantasy Games Unlimited, real quick. Villains and Vigilantes, never played it, but always wanted to. Saw these ads all the time. I did play Aftermath. I still have the books. It was one of the crunchiest games I ever bought and tried to play and failed at playing. And maybe someday I'll try to play it. I don't know. Chivalry and Sorcery, Bushido, games that I never played. But Fantasy Games Unlimited put out a lot of games back in the day, and they had a lot of ads in Dragon Magazine. Here's an article called A Set of Rules for Game Reviews, Guidelines for the Writers and the Readers. As an 11-year-old kid, there's no way I would have read this, but as a grown-ass man, I totally am into this. I think it really provides a lot of different options. He talks about the 3 types of reviews. So the capsule review, the feature review, and then the critical review. So different ways to kind of review materials. So for people who aren't like trained writers or journalists, this is a really insightful way for you to learn how to kind of do reviews of different things. Nowadays, there's so much content on YouTube of game product review stuff, but I think it's hard to find really critical thinking when people review stuff. Sometimes people talk about just what's obvious, like the cover. They don't really do a lot of additional analysis. And in a way, this whole series from the Vault is kind of a review. I'm not really reviewing these Dragon magazines. I'm just kind of sharing them and commenting. But again, that's kind of, in and of itself, its own review form. Here's a really time-consuming game. So here's a review about a game. And the game is called Time Ship. I'm going to skip it. I never played it. Maybe you did. If you did, write me a comment in the below, and maybe I'll explore it more. And then there's Illuminati. It's a conspiracy. That's another game. Now, I never played Illuminati, but I remember people who played it, and I remember maybe wanting to play it, and that was from Steve Jackson Games. Yo Ho Ho Horatio, Privateers and Gentlemen. There's another game review. Man, Myth, and Magic is a miss. There's another game review. Oh, so here's a coming soon page. This is a TSR ad page. So The Cleansing War of Garrick Blackhand. That's a Gamma World adventure. Then we have Star Frontiers, which is another game that we played, sci-fi game. World of Greyhawk fantasy setting. I owned it. I foolishly sold it because I thought I'd never need it, and now I cry at least once a week. And then another Star Frontiers, Draw Me and Run, and then Horror on the Hill, Dungeons & Dragons module. So, gift ideas for the holiday season. This was a December article, which I think you would have received prior to December. So, but there's some books here. off-the-shelf section that they have. Ooh, the Palladium role-playing game. Here's an ad for that. Great fun. I did play that, but not back in the day. I actually didn't play Palladium until the early 90s when another group of friends who I met had been playing it, and they were kind of more Palladium oriented than D&D, and it was a fun game. Fun fantasy game. All right, now we get to the Gamer's Guide. A lot of little articles and ads, sorry, not articles, little ads for smaller companies and startups and little products. They have, of course, at the back, the sci-fi and gaming convention calendar. Because, you know, remember, the internet wasn't really what it is now, so, like, nerds needed to know where things were happening, and Dragon Magazine was that resource. Here's the Dungeons & Dragons calendar for 1984, a full-page ad for that. And then, of course, the comics at the end. So there's What's New, which I was never a really big fan of, but then we get to Wormy, which I was a fan of. And this seems to be just a one-page Wormy serial. And then Snarf Quest. That was by Larry Elmore, and I loved Snarf Quest. I love the characters, I love the art. Kind of reminded me of Conan the Barbarian or Cerebus, but mixed with fantasy and some sci-fi. I don't know. Kind of an interesting cross-genre thing. Maybe post-apocalyptic. But that's Snarf Quest. That brings us to the end of the magazine. And on the back is an ad for Fellowship of the... Oh, Iron Crown Enterprises. Yeah, so they made... somehow they got the rights to Tolkien's games. And they did games related to that. So this was my most precious issue 80 of Dragon Magazine, my very first issue. And I finally found it after all these years, and it lives in plastic and in a carefully combined storage place. So thanks for tuning in to this extremely long episode of From the Vault. Of course, I have dozens more of these coming down the pipeline when I have time to make them. But if you haven't checked out the other content on my channel, there's a lot of actual play games, D&D with high school students, some spin-off shows, and then my partnership with Initiative Coffee Company featuring The Bard's Tale. Check that out. Subscribe to the Initiative YouTube channel. And stay tuned. There will be more nostalgia trips with future episodes of From the Vault. Thanks for watching.